I'd like to thank the Leather Crafters and Saddlers Journal for sponsoring my channel. They do a ton for the leather crafting community and have a great publication. I highly suggest checking them out. Hi, I'm Tony Allen Bernier, and I'm going to show you how to make a vase and a cloche. The vase is going to be the same process for the other vase and the bowl as well, so you just follow along and do those if you're doing the alternative stuff. And I'm going to do another giveaway too. I'm going to be giving away one of my DVD sets. So if you like this video, comment on it and make sure you're subscribed to my channel so you get an alert when I do my next video. That's when I'll announce who wins this. My next video is going to be just a little short one on the Weaver 8-ton clicker press. I ordered one, it got here today, so I'm excited to use it and see what I think. I'll tell you why I decided to go that route and what I think of it. First, cut the pattern out a little bit larger than the outside line. That way we'll have a good amount of playroom when we cut this out after we tool it. And we'll do all the tooling and I'll antique it and everything before I lay this back on here and cut it out. That way I know every part will be just right. But before I tape that down, I'm going to put some tape on the back. And since this is real sticky tape, I'll place it against a piece of fabric or something to get it a little less sticky first. I like to fold the end just to make it a little easier to pull this off later on. I'm going to take a knife and just trim that excess that's sticking off the edges, and then we'll tape this down to the front. I try to do this in as few pieces of tape as possible. That way, while I'm tracing it, I don't get stuck on all the lips. I'll flip this over and trim that excess off of that. Now what I'll do is I'll just trace this section that I'm going to be tooling first. I'll take this off, tool it, and then I'll be cutting little pieces out so I can lay this back down after that and trace all these and cut those. Just like when you're cutting, I find it comes out cleaner if you trace every line that comes on top first. So like in this case, since this one butts up against that one, this one I would trace first. But if I don't, what I do is I just stop a hair short. That way as I'm tracing this line, I don't hit it and it doesn't mess me up. Alright, the tracing's all done for this section from there to there. I'm going to wait on that. But I like to lift this up at like an angle, let the light hit it. And usually you can spot where you forgot to trace. And also while I'm peeling this up off of here, I'll go real slow and just watch for any spots that I may have missed, like right here. So then I can just lay this down and hit that real quick. A couple things I keep in mind while I'm cutting is, like for instance, this element drops behind this section here. So usually you always want to try to cut the top one whenever possible first. But since that falls behind there, instead of starting, even though that's like a 90-degree coming right off of that other cut, instead of starting in the cut, I'll go real light and not cut right up to the other one. That way, when I tool across there and depress that, that edge won't want to flip up at all. It will definitely be pulled down and tucked behind there. Continue that cut. Make sure you're fading your cuts at the end. Everywhere this is marked on the pattern, that's where I'm going to stop that cut. Fade it so it stops right at that point. Since this little element here has a lot of detail, I'll just cut shallower. And again, I'm not cutting right up to that line. Cut a little bit shallower. And you can get those finer detail cuts. If I was going real deep there, it'd be hard to get the knife to turn and to get that detail in that cut. And since that's such a sharp point, I'm not meeting the cuts up there. Otherwise that little edge will flip up. I can feel my knife starting to drag a little bit. So I'll hit it on the strop quite a bit while I'm going through this stuff. I usually keep a little rag handy just to give the blade a gentle wipe, just to make sure there's none of that jeweler's rouge on there. And whenever I can, I try to keep it cutting to the right and the circle turning towards me, because then I can pull with my whole arm instead of trying to just eke it along with finger strength. So again, I didn't meet that cut up right there. With all these cuts here, if I start meeting all those together, parts will start flipping up and it'll look real muddied right there. Stop that short. Now, since this one isn't falling behind anything and it's not a real sharp corner, I'll meet those cuts. Because if that pops up a little, it's not going to look weird. But like right here, if I meet those cuts, this edge is going to flip up. And that's pretty small, so just to make sure I can get it to where I need it, sometimes I'll do this side first, and then if I have to cut out a little bit further, I will. So I go shallow, so I can try to get that cut detailed in there. But yeah, to make it look nice, I had to come out just a little bit further. And I'll just fade it back into the marked line. You can also start where a cut fades out. Just make sure you're going real light and ease into the leather. I almost always start with a small beveler. And I like to do just the inside stuff first. And I just barely tool past those faded cuts. Maybe like half the width of the beveler past the end of those cuts, and I'm barely hitting it. And then as soon as I get away from that end, then I start giving a little bit more. But I'd much rather go lightly and then go back over it again than just to try to get real deep. And I kind of get in the groove of going light and just working it in slowly so it looks real clean. So I go real shallow around this stuff here because there's like 3 layers we got to deal with. So by going lightly and shallow, you'll have enough depth to work with to get each one of these layers to look good. If this tooling is looking muddy on the inside, you can come clean it up with a modeling spoon after you get all this beveling done. If you're using a small beveler, remember that since it's so small, it doesn't take a whole lot of force to get the same amount of depth as you would having to hit hard with a big beveler. And since I didn't meet those cuts there, it grabs that point, tucks it in there real nice. So the reason I just do all the elements first and not the background is I get real diligent about just making sure I go as clean as I can, and I just get in that mode while I'm doing all this internal stuff. When I'm about to grab another line here too, I always lift my tool up and just trace it back real quick and make sure I'm beveling on the right side. So now I just have everything beveled internally, and if I see some misalignment or parts that kind of look a little weird, you can kind of tuck them in. There is some play, and if you're not going to use antiquing, you got to be real careful with this because it's going to open it up and show the inside of the cut. But if you're going to antique afterwards, a lot of that will get covered up. And if you feel like any of this is a little messy, you can just clean it up. So now I can just speed it up a little bit more. And it helps to have a little weight or something on here. I didn't use one of these for the longest time, and Steve Yezek said I needed to. And he talked me into trying it, and it makes a world of difference. Make one of these. This is just filled with some shot. I'm being real careful when I get to these points because that backgrounder will get in there, and if that doesn't, we'll clean it up with a different tool I have. But I'm going harder now, just trying to get some depth. And for the most part, you can ride in the groove. When you get to the end of some of these points, you'll want to tense your hand up a little bit because you can't really ride the groove, and I like to go just past it. Make sure I get that point in there. And all those extra little bevels and stuff will get covered up when we do the backgrounder. Also like to have it at an angle a little bit, pushing away from the elements. If it's straight up and down, sometimes it might push into it and cause some kind of muddiness. If the cut closed up a little bit and you can't really ride in it as well, I'll just go across it lightly first, making sure I'm right on there, and then come back across it a little bit harder. Make sure I'm stopping before I start marking up the opposite side here, and we'll finish that point off with a couple other tools. I went around everything with that small beveler, but before I background, I like to come in with just a figure beveler. You could skip that step, but sometimes when you're coming in around the edges, and you'll see that holding this at an angle sometimes isn't enough. That steep angle of the leather there will kick this into the elements sometimes. So I come in with just a figure beveler or something and just knock that down a little bit real quick. That way I just don't have to fight it as much. I'm not worried about making it look real clean right now, since I'm going to be backgrounding and that texture and everything is going to cover all that up. So I knocked that halo down just a little bit around everything, and I'm coming in with this pointed backgrounder, and this is the same texture as the bigger one I have. So I'll come in with this pointed backgrounder. Some of these are still too sharp for that to get into, and I'll come back after I'm done backgrounding with my ultrafine square tip. So I'm just getting the very edge so the texture gets right up to the elements. But this pattern, a lot of it's going to get covered up, so I'm not worried about spinning this around and making it random at this point. If you can get into these points far enough with this, cool. If not, we'll finish up later with one of my ultrafine square tip spoons. I'll tip that on its side to get the points, and then you can flip it back around to clean up stuff. Works pretty good. So I'll go around the whole perimeter with this. But I will say there's going to be a couple spots that you're not going to be able to get the big backgrounder in. So like right in between these two. So when I hit these up, I'll make sure just to spin it around a little bit random, just give some extra taps so that other one doesn't have to get in there so far. Be careful not to press this in to the elements. It will get kicked in and mark up the edges. And I am tipping this away from this stuff a little bit. So on this edge I'll be tipping this way. Right here I'll be tipping this way a little bit, just so it doesn't kick in on accident. I went around the whole perimeter with that pointed backgrounder, and now I'm going to use this bigger one, and I filed a couple of the sides off just so as I'm spinning it randomly I can get pretty close. And I'm going to cover up a lot of what I just did, except for right up to that edge, so then it'll look like nice and clean and it'll still have that randomness to it. And this one I'm spinning around, flipping it back and forth, and just trying to be as random as I can with it. So I'll go around everything with this, and then you can see where that tape stuck, And you might need to put that pattern back on here if you don't have any guides like this, but where that tape stuck and it was bigger than the pattern itself. So I just go around the whole thing right on that line so I know I'll be out far enough. That way when I cut these parts out, I won't have a bunch of background and then it stopped too early, because I want to do the whole background. I kind of want it to kind of look a little bit like stone or something like that. And if you don't want to go all the way out to the edge, you can just fade this, go like half the strength, and then very lightly, and just fade it out a little bit. And I've already given this 1 or 2 sprays as I'm doing everything, but you can see it's starting to dry out a little bit. So I'll just give it a spray with this fine mist bottle here. I'll let that soak in for about 30 seconds before I start backgrounding again. I got all the backgrounding done. I might touch it up a little bit, and we'll come back and touch this up too. But first I'm going to get these decorative cuts in here. And you can see I went around the perimeter, but as I fill this in, I want to make sure I go a little bit lighter. I don't have to go significantly lighter, but definitely a little bit lighter. That way when I come back and trace it, there'll be enough so I can get some pressure to give it a little bit of a burnish. That way we can see the lines. And you'll see what I'm talking about in a minute here. So before I do these decorative cuts, I'm going to finish this up, and I'm going to come in with a couple different texturing tools. This is just a small textured Pear shader, and this is just a textured beveler. And the beveler I'm only going to use on this little part here. I'm only going to use this textured beveler on this little part here. And the bonus of the texture is it'll hold a little bit more antiquing, so it's almost like a shading that will happen. I'm just walking these out. I took this pattern template and cut out some sections just to make it easier to line up. And I put tape on both sides so it's not sticky and it's not going to mess with our design at all here. So just line this up as best as you can. And I just make sure as I'm pressing this down that there's no wrinkles. Make sure that way everything will be lined up nice after we trace it. Now I'll just trace these. And actually what I'm going to do first is give this a little spray right here. Not much, just so that I know I'll get a good burnish when I trace those. So it can be a little bit tricky to trace this because of that texture underneath. So sometimes what I do is I go kind of light at first, and I go back and forth until I feel like it got in there and smoothed that texture out. And you can see none of these lines are connecting because this is all just decorative cuts. You can also see where it tapers. You're going to taper your cut, and where it's kind of squared off, that's where you're going to plunge the blade so it's a nice thick open cut. And some of these fade on both ends. It's a little bit tricky if you try to fade your tracing, you're not going to see it. So I just kind of go, I might lighten up a little bit, but I want that tracing to show right where I want that cut to end. So I'll usually go pretty hard through the whole line here. I'll take a look at the pattern to see which lines I want to fade and which ones I want to be deep. I should have all of them traced, but I always peel this back slowly just to make sure. Take a look, go back and forth a little bit just to make sure. Should be good. And you can see if the burnish isn't hitting where you trace, it can be kind of hard. Make sure you strop your blade. This is important for this part especially, but I'll keep this nearby so I can just keep an eye on where cuts meet, which ones fade, and which ones are going to be thick at the top. And as you get these parts done, I like to keep one of the parts that I finished right by me so that I can see which areas I did pear shading in, what my decorative cuts look like and stuff. So I'm just really taking my time with these. And if I feel my blade start to stick at all, I strop it right away. I'm really paying attention to these lines and stuff. So even though I traced it, the spacing might be off a little bit. So I'm really watching where the other line is corresponding so that it always narrows. See, like on the pattern, this one actually starts shallow and fades on the top as well. So I'll start shallow, and then at the bottom I fade again. I've already stropped this knife twice doing these cuts. It's just real important that you keep it nice and smooth. And you know, there's going to be some discrepancies, so what I'll do as I complete these is I'll just use one that's completed to go off of and really focus on making sure they're the same. So if some of these lines are a little weird, you can come in with a small tool, touch them up a little bit. Sometimes I like to open these corners up just a little. And if your leather's a little too dry, these cuts are going to close right back up. So you might want to give it a spray and come back with the modeling spoon. So I'm going to do the decorative cuts on the tooling section, so I'll have one of these that I'd already completed sitting right next to me. Before I'm done, you can come and round some of these edges off like I do sometimes, but I've been leaving these ones kind of squared. What I'll do is I'll come in with one of my tools. This is an ultrafine square tip, and I'll tip it on its side so it's pointed and just clean all these corners up that I couldn't reach with the backgrounder. And you can hit that point, and if you need to flip it back to the flat side, just to clean that edge up. Another thing these square tip spoons are good for, the round ones should do it too, is for like a pedal lifter. I'll also come in with just a pointed modeling spoon. some of these edges might not be completely rounded just right, so you can tuck some of those little spots in. Like I mentioned this one earlier, so I'll tuck this in on this side where it comes in right here. I'll tuck it in right before and right after, just to try to fix that up a little bit. If you're not going to antique, I wouldn't suggest doing this much, because you're going to open your cuts up a little bit and you're going to see them. So you can see it's a little off right here. You just tuck that little spot in, and you can really finish it off and make it look nice and round. That should be good. And I'll flip this back over and peel this tape off. So what I do is I get it started and really hold down this back part, because it's really going to only go to here. So you can press down and the back part can get all messed up. It won't be on there. Really hold it down with my palm and try to pull this straight across so that I'm not bending and messing with the tooling. So instead of moving up and pressing down here right where the tooling is, I'll keep my hand back. You can see this tape still sticks really well, and I even pressed it against fabric to make it less sticky. And let it dry. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll flip this over and put just a little bit of weight, not too much, just as it dries it kind of holds it flat, because it's going to want to curl up. Okay, so for the antiquing part, there's 2 coats of acrylic Resolene on there. I show how I put that acrylic Resolene on in a different video of mine. The dyeing, sealing, I think I do edges in it too. But I'll just dump some antiquing onto a couple pieces of tape so it doesn't just soak into the cardboard. Got a small piece of shearling, and I do it this way so I don't go through this stuff real quick, so I don't have a ton of that. But I'll get a couple paper towels ready, and I use a brush. Actually, Steve Yezik showed me how to do this with the brush. I like it how it works. I don't go through as much antiquing either. Before, if I just applied it with a rag, I felt like I had to put a lot more on it just to spread it around quick. Less antiquing goes a lot further with this brush. So I just make sure it's in all those cuts there. Then I'll just grab a couple paper towels, get as much of this excess off. I'm just going real light. And you can see how it's basically like real bright and then real dark. So to get kind of a shaded effect, I use a piece of shearling and just barely touch the surface and spread it around and pull it out of some of those tooling marks to make it more of a shaded tone. And once I get that, I come back with a paper towel again. I'm just very lightly going over the top, holding this as flat as I can. So instead of it being so high contrast, it kind of makes that more of a little bit of a shaded effect in the tooling marks. You can do it again if you want to lighten those up. And then even beyond that, if you want to try to pull some of the real high highlights out again, clean paper towel or a clean side, spray it with just a little bit of mist, and you're just barely rubbing the top of the surface here. You want to keep this really flat. It doesn't pull a whole lot off, but it's enough to bring them highlights back out. And if you want to bring some of these cuts together, I like to tie these two in by going like this a little bit. Just brighten it around the cuts just a little. Seems to kind of pull the two different elements together a little more. So that's how I do the antiquing on these parts. I like to try to do different stuff in each video, maybe test some different things out. These top pieces for the handle and then the bottom plate have kind of a cool little marble effect on it. I did that because I just didn't want it plain. And I'll show you how I did that. It kind of matches the pattern just a little bit, the background of that tooled sections. So how I did that is I just used the same exact antique color, but I mixed it 50-50 with water. So it's not quite so thick. And then to get it on, I just used a wool dauber and rolled it. That way it won't be just a solid color, it'll have just a little bit of texture to it. And I just start by doing the edges first. Try to kind of cake it in there a little bit. You might have to do 2 coats, unless you get it in there real good. And then almost just like a paint roller, I'm rolling this, I'm not smearing it. Try to get it into the holes a little bit as I'm doing this. If it starts to dry too much and you can't really see the texture, just grab a little more of it. Kind of spread it around quick. As it dries, that texture will kind of come out a little bit more. And with this inner ring, before you do this too, you're going to want to make sure you bevel this outside top edge of this inner ring. It'll help that top just kind of sit down in there. It won't have to get around that very outer edge. Kind of help direct it. See, this one I just did is already drying a little bit. I just smeared it. But you can see that that marbly effect is kind of popping out a little bit more as it dries. You can see what I did is I just printed the pattern out again and cut some chunks out. And I put a piece of tape on the front and the back so it's not sticky. That way I can line these parts up no problem. Now, since these shrunk quite a bit, you're going to want to do these 2 different parts a specific way. It helps if you have just a couple tips showing and you want to line up the top as best you can. So all that looks correct. And then you look down at the bottom how much of that line is poking over each side. So I'll hold it at the top, so that's the pivot point, and I'll pivot the pattern until I have equal amounts going over on each side, and all the excess I leave at the bottom as well. So once the top's lined up and both sides look about the same, that's where I'll tape it down. And I make sure to hold this down while I'm doing it, because if the leather's curling up, you're not going to get an accurate placement. And I make sure to really press the tape down so it's sticking good. That's how I do the small ones. The big ones, it's a little bit trickier, but it's not bad. Again, I'll line the top up and put my finger down and use that as a pivot point. I go back and forth until it looks like it's about the same on each side as far as how much these lines are overlapping. And then I'll leave that excess on the bottom and leave the top lined up. And I'll grab a couple of little pieces first just to tack it down and check it again. And then I'll tape it fully down. And again, I'm pushing this tape down on the edges to make sure it sticks really well. Before I sew these parts together, I like to spray the back a little bit and wrap them around something like this bottle and just get that curve in there and let them dry so that they kind of already want to be in that shape. So these will be the next two, and I'll say also make sure your pattern's set up the way you want it, so every other one, this one will be here, so it's like doubling up the pattern. So this one would be on top of that one. So what I do is the one on the inner side, maybe even the outer side one a little, just a tiny bit of moisture. And the inner side, I'll give just a little bit more, hitting more of it kind of out here. And that'll help it compress a little bit on the inside, but it'll still press on the outside one enough to kind of, instead of being real sharp, it'll try to round that corner off a little bit. You're going to want to pull these stitches real tight as you're sewing these together. And I like to sew 2 together at a time and do 3 of those and then sew 2 of the 2 together. But each time I line them up how I want the pattern. This is how it's designed. So it repeats, goes towards itself every other one like this. The other reason you're going to want to make sure you have, like this side is going to be underneath the one coming over it. You want to make sure you do that correctly also, because these patterns are askew just a little bit to one side so that they'll still appear to be centered on the parts. So once you're sure you have the part on the right side and you sprayed the back of at least the inner one just a little bit so that it can compress slightly, start sewing these together. It really helps to have a stitching pony. And this is where you're really going to be happy if you hole punch the back side of the part. It's going to make it a lot easier to go back and forth. So they're starting to get a little bit harder to keep them lined up. Make sure you pull these real tight. And if you need to give it another light spritz on the back, try to get just the inside part, go for it. So I have the 3 sets done. And as I was sewing these together, I made sure that each one of these was mirror image from the other, and that I can sew them together and they'll all line up nice. So getting these together isn't as hard as the vase. Same thing as before. The part that's going to the inside, you're going to want to spray that with a little bit of water here. And sew those 2 together. But now we're just going to sew this last one on and make sure we got this lined up the right way. I have all the panels sewn together. I just need to link this very last one here. And just like always, I'll determine which side will be the inside, and I'll give that a decent spray. I'm focusing the majority like right here, so it's not getting hit as much on the very edge or in here, because this is going to soak out anyways. I don't want this to be too wet right where the stitches are. And I will hit the top layer a little bit too. Not as much. The first like 3 or 4, I'll just leave them loose. And then once I get down a few, I'll tighten them up. Make sure you get them pulled tight. Alright, so the other option is trying to get this lined up, but if it's giving you trouble, you'll just come through one layer at a time, like so. And then you just tighten it up to get them to match up here. So first we'll go over the bottom pieces that this will be sitting on. Now this is different from the bowl. This is the little container with the lid and stuff. The bowl basically sits up like this, and it just has a bottom like the vases. But what I did with this is, if you have something round that you can put in here to let it sit and kind of form it so it's rounder, it helps. Give it a little spray and let it sit, or you can just do that with this. But this is the bottom. It's just these 3 parts. It has a decorative stitch just on that, the round one, and then this trim piece. And make sure you're beveling this top edge of this piece so that this can kind of hit it and then fall in place around it like that. And then you'll have like a little stand that it's sitting on and whatnot. So that's, I just did the decorative stitches, then I'll sew all 3 together at the same time, just line up the holes. And the top is a few pieces. So you can see a couple of these I didn't dye, just the edges I dyed. So you're going to sew these 2 together just along that line, and these 2 together along that line, because then these 2 will go in between. This one goes on top of those 2 pieces, and this one goes on top to cap it all off. And you'll sew all of those together at the same time. The only one with the stitching chisel punched is these. The rest are all hole punched through to make it easier to get the needles through and whatnot. And after you have that whole handle apparatus stitched together, then you're going to stitch it to the top of this case, or on this very outside perimeter. So then you'll have your little handle to pull it on and off of this base for like a display. And once you get it placed on there, so you know all the holes are lined up, I'll even grab another extra needle or 2 just to really make sure. Then I'll just work around that perimeter, and then we'll sew this to the top part. Now we can sew this onto the top of here. It's pretty easy because you can just get your hand in there. So when I use this front needle to find the holes and to line stuff up, when I press it through, I place the back needle on it so I can follow it right back through the hole. And what I'm doing is I'm sticking this needle through the hole. I'm placing this needle right up alongside it, matching its angle, like holding it right here. So I know as soon as I pull this one back through, I can just follow it at the exact angle I just came out. I got the stitching around the top. I wanted to do that after I dyed the inside. It just looks a little cooler. And I wanted to say, when you're doing this, the bowl is going to be done the same as the top of this if you make the bowl, but this display plate, you're going to go around this perimeter without going over this edge from those. So I'm just going to go around that perimeter, and this part will be done. So this is the base, but I decided to put another layer underneath it here. So I'm going to take these stitches out and stitch these two together. And then this round one, while I was stitching these on, this round one should have been stitched underneath at the same time. So then it just raises it up off the ground a little bit better. It'll have a little bit nicer look. So what I'll do, since I'm not doing this till now, is I'll just sew this round one on the bottom of this, and then I'll strip these stitches and sew these together. And then this will be done as well. So this was the old base, and then this is the new one. This is the bottom of it. And now I will just sew these back together here. Just put them in the corners and then stick this in my stitching pony and everything should be lined up nice. Here's the base all done up. And this just will sit right on top of that. And I like to have the top sitting on at an angle from these sides. It seems to look a little bit nicer. When you're sewing around this perimeter, you're going to want to keep in mind how well it fits on here. If you pull too tight, you may make this opening too small. And on top of that, just make sure it fits on there good, and it might be better to do it before this is on. You can see what's going on under there. But if you can't get it on here, you might need to grab something round that's just a little bit bigger than this. Give this a little spray on these inside edges right here, and then let that sit overnight over that round object. So then this kind of has that shape already. So I think I'm pulling my stitches a little bit tight to see if I can get a snugger fit, but if it ends up being too tight, what I can do is give this a little spray and just kind of splay this edge out just enough to fit over this. But it's going to be close, so you may need to pull the stitches tight to kind of shrink it down a hair, or you may need to put something in there and stretch it out, or like after I sew, I'm going to splay this edge just a little bit if I need to, get a good fit. Well, the vase goes together just a little bit differently because you got to deal with this real narrow opening. So what I do is I get 4 of these together, and before I put these 2 on, I'm going to sew to the inside, this bottom panel. I'll sew that inside there, and then I'll sew these 2 to the inside of that bottom panel. Then I'll work my way up the sides. See, I'm slowly getting this on, and you want to make sure to pull these stitches extra tight so it really pulls everything into that base. The hardest part is going through the corners. What I ended up doing is trying to kind of form it and hold it where I needed it to be, but just went through one layer at a time. I'm 1 stitch away from the corner before sewing on these other last 2. And since this one goes over the top of this one, they already sprayed the inside edges like I was with all the other ones. I'm going to slide that under there and then continue on all the way around and tie a good knot. Then I'll start working up the sides here, stopping intermittently on each side and going back and forth. As long as I can get my hands in there, I can keep going up. But I'll stop so that I can get the other side easier. And then once I get where it's going to get too narrow, I'll leave a lot of thread hanging. So that way I can, once I get to the top, pull them tight one at a time. The bottom is on. And I sprayed the edges like I have been before. And either I'll set this in my lap, or you can set it on your table with a weight or something in it to kind of hold this up towards you. So I went up to about right there. That way, as I'm coming up, I can still get my hand in there. And when I get closer, I really only need to get my fingers in there so much. But I'll come up to about that same spot. I got up to about there, and I don't want to push it. So to tie that knot, and I actually already tied it, so it's not going to loosen up, but this is what I did. So I always start with a double. So I'll go through once and then twice. That way it really holds it once you get it tight. And I wrapped it around this finger a whole bunch so I could get in there and then push across the other way. Pulled this way, got it real tight, pushed these together, tightened it up even more, and then carefully did just a couple of the single knots to lock it into place, doing that same method. And then I'm gonna get a really long piece of thread, and I'll stitch a few and then show you what I'm talking about. A little tricky, but the method seems to work for getting those tight ones closed there. You can see how I'm just leaving as much slack that it wants to just stay open. And I put a couple of these rubber things on my fingers. I clip the end off and then flip them inside out. I feel like they grab the needle in my finger, hold my finger a little bit better. But sometimes it's nice to wear these so you can get in there and just grab it in between your fingers instead of having to have your thumb in there. And the other thing you can do is put it in between these 3 fingers so you don't have to get your whole hand in there. And I'm just leaving it real loose, and we'll just pull them up once we're done here. Just gotta make sure you give yourself a lot of extra slack. See, I was able to just grab it between these 2 fingers. So I'll usually just come up that one hole instead of trying to do both at once, and then come up through this one. So it gets a little easier once you get up a little bit and you have all this slack. That's how I did that. I checked frequently to make sure I was going through the correct way, but I stopped at the second to the last hole on top and just tied a knot. And as I pull that up, I'll have plenty of slack to finish that off. What I want to do is this side first. And I'll do the same thing. I might be able to pull it a little bit tighter, but we'll get that to the top, and then we'll tighten everything off, and the very last thing will be to stitch around the top perimeter. Last 2 sides are done with that slack tied on the second hole from the top. And what I'll do is grab the pears here. I'm actually gonna go up a little bit and start grabbing them and bringing that slack down. That way it'll give me enough to pull. I'll kind of squeeze it together and do one thread at a time too, just to make sure I get all that slack pulled up. And we're going to get these up front here. This is going to make it easier for me to pull one at a time and just keep working them back. I'm trying not to pull from this way, just pulling up and get those good and tight. And then you can just grab these. Be careful not to scratch the piece. And you can usually go 2 and it'll tighten back far enough to where give it a check, make sure you're getting that tension you need. Just make sure you're getting it good and tight and you should be fine. Actually, at this point, it's starting to kind of get in my way. So I'm going to pull all this slack up, leave those there, and then just, not fully, but just get these pulled up to the top so I don't have all these layers getting squeezed in there as I'm trying to go. And again, I'm only pulling from this one. I don't want to tighten these up. Just going to make it hard to get the tool under there to pull them up. I'll just finish getting this to the top, and then you can see I go over this and back stitch and tie a little knot on the inside